Hello and welcome to this NPTEL course entitled Trauma and Literature. We'll be looking at Virginia Woolf's novel Mrs. Dalloway. So in this particular session, we'll discuss some of the things we have already studied in terms of the textual sections that we have covered in the last two lectures. So I just want to use some theory, some trauma theory, some existential philosophy, and of course some of the historical background of this text that we can combine those perspectives together and have a short session discussing those before we move on to the next section of the text. So we've seen how the historical setting, of course, is post-First World War London. It's a London which is trying very hard to look normal, to look speedy, to look sophisticated, to look urban. It's trying very hard to move on. But of course, as we mentioned, there is this very spectral presence of the war, which is always there. It's never quite away from this setting, from this landscape. Now, the spectrality, of course, is materialized. It just comes to the foreground in a very unsettling way. By various figures and by various machines. The figure that we have introduced to the post-traumatic stress disorder sufferer, the PTSD sufferer, is of course the soldier in the story, Septimus Smith, who comes back from the war, and of course he is someone who is suffering from trauma, but his trauma is compounded by the fact that there's no empathy at all in terms of the doctor's perspective on him, the doctor's gaze on him. And we'll talk about the gaze in due course. The gaze that Septimus suffers from the medical practitioners in this novel is not a gaze of empathy. It's not a gaze of understanding. It's not a gaze of kindness. It's a gaze of very clinical, empirical, quantifying mechanism. So he's just being seen as a problem. Well, there's a denial of his problem. So the doctors, Holmes and Bradshaw, they keep telling Septimus and they keep telling his wife that there's nothing really wrong with him, right? So he should be made to rest. He should be made to think outside of himself. So in other words, his ego seems to be a problem here. The fact that he's so absorbed in himself, that seems to be a problem. There's no connect at all between his mind and the material conditions around him. And that disconnect is something which we have talked about already. The disconnect and the disintegration, the fact that he cannot integrate back with the people, with the setting, with the urban metropolis. So there is a sense of being left out, left over, liquidated, shut down. And we stopped in the last section, if you remember. He's shutting himself down. Septimus was shutting himself down because he was literally overwhelmed by all the sensations around him, by all the machines around him. He cannot take it anymore. He cannot emote anymore. There's too much of emotions that are coming out, welling out of the system. So he's essentially having a system shut down. And we talked about how the systemic shutdown, the fact that he's choosing to shut himself down, that seems to be the only agency available to him, the only agency left to him, for him, because there's nothing else that he can do. I mean, he's completely agency-less, and that decision to shut himself down when he sees too many sensations around him, is of course an anticipation of his eventual suicide in the novel. When he jumps from the window and kills himself. That suicide, of course, we'll read that in details in due course, but that suicide may be interpreted as a very extreme an action of agency, the only agency that he has over his life, the only ownership that he has, and that is over his life. So he kills himself by jumping from a building, a Georgian window. Now, so Septimus's detachment, disintegration, and distancing from everything around him. So the whole idea of shutting yourself down becomes, like I mentioned, an extreme act of agency. Now, Septimus's disconnect, as I just mentioned, we should be able to study that medically, but also historically, because as we can see, when he comes back from the war, he's not really treated as a war hero, because there's a degree of disavowal, rejection that he suffers from society. And interestingly, those of you interested in the study of war and literature and trauma would also know that one of the key wars in which this happened systematically was the Vietnam War. Because the Vietnam-American War, that was a war in which PTSD, a post-traumatic stress disorder, the soldier trauma, was actually classified in the medical dictionary as a recognizable disease. So in some sense, Mrs. Dalloway may be seen as some kind of an anticipation to what happened to the veterans in the Vietnam War, because there was a sense of shame about the war as well. It was more complicated, the Vietnam War. But even the First World War, as we can see when Septimus comes back, he's not treated as a war hero. He's just seen as some sort of a leftover, someone who, can't fit in anymore. There's no empathy, there's no recognition, there's a sense of shame about him as well. And that obviously compounds his suffering. So we need to look at Septimus's character. we need to examine Septimus's character, not just medically. Of course, the medical thing is very complex, but that is actually compounded by the existential rejection that he had, the social rejection, the alienation that he suffers socially as well as existentially. And his alienation is very, very important. I will connect this idea of alienation to the idea of reification or commodification. And the reason I'm using this very Marxist terms in a very, very conceptual way, because the whole idea of reification is a process through which an entity or an individual becomes a commodity, right? Now, Septimus's reification had occurred through repression, the fact that he was trained not to emote. That was part of his emotional training before he went to the war, as he went to the war. So along with the physical training of being a soldier, there was also this very emotional training of clinically detaching yourself from all kinds of emotional responses. So there is a character called Evans in the story, and we'll read the character in due course. And Septimus's relationship with Evans is very complex. There is a very subtle hint that they may have been lovers, and may have become romantic, they may have had a homoerotic relationship. But in any case, they had a very, very strong bond, a very strong relationship, a very, very strong connect. Maybe as friends, maybe as lovers, we don't quite know. It's not really spelled out, it's left hanging. But there's definitely a lot of hints dropped in terms of Septimus's relationship with Evans. Now, we come to know that when Evans died in the war, and he died of a bomb explosion, Septimus did not cry, Septimus did not react, Septimus did not emote, because he had so thoroughly and clinically internalized the idea of emotionlessness as part of his military masculinity, that he thought emoting is something which is an expression of weakness, an expression of breakdown, expression of agencylessness. And this constant indoctrination, this constant internalization of this kind of military masculinity obviously compromises them agentically, compromises them emotionally. In other words, to use a very colloquial term, it disturbs his senses. It completely disorients them. So when he comes back from the war, and when he is not able to emote, when he's not able to feel, so his control over his emotions is completely gone. It's completely non-existent. It's completely compromised. So either he's over-emoting or he's unable to emote. So the normal emotional equilibrium that Septimus used to have, that is just completely disappeared. And that obviously comes with the training, the military training. Now, again, those of you who are interested in this kind of relationship between emotion, trauma, and military masculinity, and all kinds of extreme forms of masculinity. I mean, even if you take a look at some popular culture today, you find that this detachment from emotion, this clinical systematic training of being emotionless, that is something which is pervaded even in popular culture today. I mean, for example, if you take a look at the Bourne series, the Bourne legacy films, so even the spin-off from that, there's a spin-off in Amazon Prime called Treadstone. Even there we find that one of the trainings that these people receive in a dystopian world, of course, is the ability to be emotionless, the ability to be clinical killers, to kill people, to kill other people without any empathy. So what we're talking about here is the complete annihilation of empathy, the systematic annihilation of empathy that comes with training. Now, what happens when a training goes away? What happens when an extreme war situation goes away and we come back to civilian space where you're expected to empathize, where you're expected to receive and enact empathy? Now, therein lies the problem with Septimus, because his ability to empathize is completely gone. His ability to connect emotionally in a balanced way is completely gone. And on top of that, he suffers from emotionlessness. He suffers from lack of empathy from his doctors, who also are trained medically in their profession to have a clinical detachment from the patients, the human subject. So in other words, the entire novel may be seen as a crisis in humanity, the crisis in the human connect, the human intersubjective connect. There is no intersubjective economy. Each subject exists on a different island, and each one fails to connect to the other person. And not just Septimus. So take a look at Mrs. Dalloway, Clarissa Dalloway, Peter Walsh, everyone, and all the characters in the novel, they all seem to be exhibiting or inhabiting different points in space which are not connected to each other. So London over here, the city of London, the metropolis of London, becomes essentially it's a very complex chronotop, and I'm using the word chronotop in a Bakhtinian way. Chrono and topos. Chrono is time, topos is space, the topography. So the space-time, the complex space-time of London is a space type of disintegration, where everyone is alienated from everyone else, where everyone's disintegrated from everyone else. And this degree of disconnect and disintegration is something which typically informs this post-war London. So we're looking at a novel culturally, historically, materially, medically as an example of extreme alienation. And of course, we should not just look at this from the perspective of masculinity studies, because if you take a look at, for example, Septimus's wife, Lucretia, she's an Italian woman. She's obviously an outsider to London, linguistically, culturally, also politically, very much an outsider. Now, she comes back to London and she's hoping to be a part of London through her husband, who was notionally an Englishman, a British person. But then he suffers disintegration as well. He cannot connect, he cannot recognize that it's London. This is a new city, a strange city for him. So there seems to be some kind of a paradigm shift, or rather a cognitive shift, a tectonic shift in cognition across the novel. So Lucretia is an outsider, Septimus is an outsider. So all a series of disconnects is something which a novel piles on top of the other. And interestingly, none of these characters really meet. I mean, Septimus and Clarissa never really meet, but then Clarissa sees an ambulance which takes Septimus away. So there is this very interesting crisscross, spatially speaking. And it's a complex space because the entire novel takes place in one day. It's a very typically modernist temporal frame. It all happens in one day, one calendar day, one clock time that's shared by everyone. And as I mentioned, the idea of clock time is very symbolically present, very iconically present in the construct of the Big Ben, the giant tower clock of London, which keeps chiming out the sounds, which is this distributive, shared time by everyone. But then that becomes a secondary time. The primary time of the novel is obviously the time which is psychological in quality, right? So the psychological situation of time, where people are situated psychologically, they go back and across time. So this idea of this temporal structure, or this one-day temporal structure, is a very superficial structure. And it's very deliberately superficial, because what Woolf is actually trying to do is to tease out the different temporal possibilities in the novel, where each character is inhabiting a different timescape, a different time zone, which is theoretically connected by the Big Ben, theoretically connected by one calendar day. But actually, it's a very complex division of time, and that's something which we see throughout the novel. So just to sum up, we need to look at the novel not just medically, but existentially and politically as well. It's a profoundly political novel, and it's one of those novels which look at the collusion between patriarchy and medicine, between masculinity and medicine, because the two doctors in the novel, Holmes and Bradshaw, they embody this empirical gaze, the empirical quantifying gaze, which looks at every human subject as a case study, as a commodity, which can be analyzed and classified and read and coded. And that obviously is completely empathy-less. And the empathy-lessness of the novel is something which we should really tap into as we read on. And of course, as I mentioned, the novel ends with Septimus' suicide. The day comes to an end. Clarissa Dalloway throws a party where everyone comes, but no one really connects to anyone. So what we have in the end is a massive drama of alienation, a massive drama of disintegration. And that obviously undercuts the very superficial, speedy metropolis that is London in a post-war scenario, where it's trying very hard to look speedy, trying very hard to look celebratory. And if you remember, in the last session, we looked at the toffee advertising aeroplane, the skywriting aeroplane, which was advertising for some toffee. And we've seen how even something as wonderful as a skywriting aeroplane, which is a wonder machine, that itself carries the spectral presence of the war, because people tend to freeze when they look at the airplane in the sky, because the memory of being bombed, the memory of the association between airplane and violence is still fresh in people's minds. And that degree of association is something which we see happening quite often in the novel. To Septimus, it becomes a very defamiliarized machine. And we see how the whole idea, the whole absorption of Septimus to the entire machine movement is depicted to us as readers through a very deliberate defamiliarizing style. Everything is defamiliarized or decelerated as well. It's a very delayed decoding, something which we see in Joseph Conrad as well. He manages to decode it much later. And the delay is there even on the narrative levels. Even the narrative delays it for us. The words slow down, the sounds slow down, the recognition slows down, the cognition slows down, everything slows down, right? And this very systematic slowdown of cognition is something which a novel captures, narratively speaking, right? So we have this very interesting entanglement, if you will, between narration and cognition, right? Septimus is reading of the skywriting aeroplane, K-A-R. He reads it very slowly because that's how his mind is processing it, because his mind is hurt, it's injured, it's a bruised mind, it's a traumatized mind. It cannot process anything quickly. And this lack of immediate connect is something which is there in that particular scene. And of course, as we mentioned, even to the average Londoner, there's a degree of frozenness the moment you see an airplane in the sky. And it's a very deliberate symbol that Woolf is using, because this airplane seems to be a departure. It's supposed to be a departure from the bombing airplane, the violent airplane, because this is advertising for toffee. This is advertising for a commodity which is meant to be consumed. But what gets consumed in the process is also a very spectral trauma. In other words, the novel, the landscape of the novel is slightly traumatophilic. There's a consumption of trauma that is happening all the time. It's never quite away. And Septimus, of course, is like a zombie in trauma. He's the leftover from the traumatic landscape. He's a misfit, a massive, spectacular misfit in this world, which is trying very hard to move on from his traumatic background, from his traumatic past. So this is the point that we stopped the last lecture. I'm just trying to theorize it. I'm trying to give a theoretical frame in terms of how we should be looking at the novel. So I stop at this point today, and in the subsequent lectures move on with the other selected sections from the novel. Thank you for your attention.